I would like to make a few things clear right off the bat before we get into today's video. I have absolutely no problem with HBCUs and their existence, and I very much so understand the importance of HBCUs. As time continues to go by and the population of Black Americans continue to slide further and further down the totem pole of relevancy, given the fact that by 2064, Black Americans will be fourth on the population list, HBCUs will play a significant role in making sure that Black Americans still have a safe place to congregate amongst one another without judgment and interference. By this time period, being the token Black man or woman in your neighborhood, in your classroom, or at your job will simply become commonplace more so than it already is today. So yes, in my opinion, HBCUs are very necessary in order for us to be able to build with one another moving forward into the future. But what I do have a problem with is the way in which HBCUs allow themselves to be taken advantage of by politicians and corporations, in which they run cover for these institutions in order to raise funds for their school. Now, one example of how this happens from the side of corporations would be the most recent passing of the NBA's All-Star Weekend in Atlanta. Upon announcement of the weekend, numerous NBA stars, including the league's biggest star, LeBron James, spoke out against it. Many felt that given the current health crisis that the country is currently dealing with, that it would be irresponsible to hold such an event this year. But the reality is that this one weekend alone generates millions of dollars for the NBA, and there was no way that they were going to leave all that money on the table. So how did the league justify All-Star Weekend? By dedicating All-Star Weekend to HBCUs, pledging to donate a few $1 million across numerous historical Black colleges in America. But that aside, there is no greater disrespect to the intelligence of Black voters than when politicians either begin to brag about how much money they've sent to HBCUs or pledge to send more money to fund HBCUs in order to mask the fact that no real policy or legislation will be passed in order to create tangible changes within the Black community. Now, as of recent, the topic of reparations being given to the descendants of American slavery have been picking up more attention within the mainstream media. But as this topic continues to pick up more attention, more and more people within the mainstream media continue to make it a point to deliberately misrepresent what reparations looks like. In a recent interview with Charlemagne the God, Bill Maher stated that Obamacare was a form of reparations for the descendants of American slavery. In a recent Washington Post article titled, "Relief Bill is Most Significant Legislation for Black Farmers Since Civil Rights Act, Experts Say," it's noted that within the American Rescue Plan, $5 billion will be allocated for so-called disadvantaged farmers. And in that same article, it states that Black farmers make up a quarter of disadvantaged farmers. So now let's go to Google and do some quick math. What's 1/4 of $5 billion? So now let's see what the Washington Post article has to say about this $1.25 billion. While it's a fraction of the $1.9 trillion bill that passed in the Senate on Saturday, advocates say it still represents a step toward righting a wrong after a century of mistreatment of Black farmers by the government and others. Some say it's a form of reparations for African Americans who have suffered a long history of racial oppression. Now, it is important for me to note that within this article, they did quote William Darity Jr., who stated that the notion that this approaches a program of reparations is nonsense. But that quote doesn't come up until halfway through the article. The writers at the Washington Post understand very well that the average person does not read whole articles. They read the sensational headline and at best 2 to 3 paragraphs depending on how long the article is. So in the case of this article, the average reader just read that this is the biggest piece of legislation since the Civil Rights Act and Black farmers are getting reparations. But the most egregious form of the misrepresentation of reparations is undoubtedly from White House senior advisor Cedric Richmond. And what I'm going to do right now is read a few paragraphs from this article in the New York Post in which they give direct quotes from Cedric in regards to how the Biden administration is not going to wait on H.R. 40 to pass through Congress and the Senate in order to study reparations, because they're going to act on reparations now. The White House is going to start acting now to address reparations to African Americans, a White House senior advisor said in an interview as Congress debates forming a commission to study how the policy could be implemented. "We don't have to wait on a study. We're going to start acting now," he told the outlet. We have to start breaking down systemic racism and barriers that have held people of color back, and especially African Americans, Richmond told the outlet. We have to do stuff now. Now, I'm not sure why people of color is being brought up. Sounds like a whole bunch of benign neglect to me because we're supposed to be talking about reparations, but this is to be expected. Let's carry on. If you start talking about free college tuition to historically black colleges and universities, and you start talking about free community college in Title I and all those things, I think that you are well on your way. If the Biden administration actually supported a bill to study reparations to the degree that they say they do, then why doesn't Joe Biden simply sign an executive order to put in place the commission himself? Well, we all know the answer to that question. It's because he doesn't actually support reparations, and we've documented that in numerous videos on this channel. And the reality is that since African Americans are going to keep blindly voting Democrat anyways, then why would he do that? As the old saying goes, why buy the cow when the milk is free? They'll just keep insulting your intelligence by taking bills that they were already going to pass anyways and highlighting the points within it that may possibly benefit you and calling it reparations. Obamacare was reparations. The American Rescue Plan is reparations. Everything is reparations as long as it doesn't exclusively benefit the descendants of American slavery. I want you to pay attention to how every time there's a conversation on reparations, this government always finds a way to tie in people of color. Pay attention to the language being used. Isn't it interesting that now mainstream media is always talking about systemic racism and white supremacy? These used to be the talking points reserved for us crazy people on YouTube, remember? Now it's mainstream news. And I don't put it past this government to at some point in time implement a pseudo reparations package for people of color. I talked about this not too long ago in a live stream where I broke down how the Justice Democrats, better known as the Squad, or as I like to say, the Fraud Squad, are looking at doing exactly that. And to be even more particular, what I want to do today is focus on Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because for progressive Democrats as a whole, AOC is their Lord and Savior, right? And when it comes to this particular organization, the Justice Democrats, she's the model for progressive Democrats that they want to continue to reproduce over and over and over again. So before we get into all of that concerning AOC, what I want to do is that I want to give a response to a comment that somebody made in my last video concerning the Justice Democrats and reparations, right? So let's scroll down a little bit and let's go to platform. Okay. I just want to make a quick point before we get into AOC. And then we're going to scroll down over here to Third Reconstruction. Now let's read this over again. We're just going to do a quick review because I really need to respond to this. Okay. This is their reparations platform for you concerning the Justice Democrats and progressive Democrats. All right. We have never completed the project of Reconstruction. The first Reconstruction was stymied by violent terrorism in the 19th century. The second Reconstruction was stopped by white backlash to the civil rights movement. America must reconcile with our past by creating a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission to lead our nation through a process that investigates the general harms caused by slavery and Jim Crow and propose necessary reparations. Now, what I pointed out in my last video when I read this the last time, somebody said in the comment section, you said that they're not talking about Black people because nowhere in this little description that I read to you do you see Black people, Black American, or African Americans, let alone the technical terms that some of us like to use, like ADOS, FBA, or I say Descendants of American Slavery. When I made that statement, somebody commented and said, well, they said slavery and Jim Crow, so that's Black people. That's Descendants of American Slavery. What are you talking about? And what I want to propose to you today, and some of you might be aware of this already, is that if it's not defined, if you do not see Black Americans, African Americans, Descendants of American Slavery, whatever, if there's no definition, as to who they're talking to, it is not a foregone conclusion that when you say slavery and Jim Crow, you're talking about black people. It's not a foregone conclusion anymore. One of the papers that I want to pull up right now to prove this point is this. Okay. Let me read this off to you. And I've read this off in a video before, but I'm going to read this off to you one more time. Because as crazy as it sounds, it is not a foregone conclusion that when you say slavery and Jim Crow, you're talking about the descendants of American slavery, let alone black people as a whole. So let's get into that. Let me pull this up for you, okay? This paper right here is titled A Brief History of Slavery and the Origins of American Policing. All right? I'll read it again. A Brief History of Slavery and the Origins of American Policing. This was written by Dr. Victor E. Kapler. Now, for the sake of time, I'm not going to read his bio on LinkedIn, but what I will do is that I will copy paste his bio to, I will copy paste the link to his bio in LinkedIn in the live chat, so you can click on it yourself. And you'll see that this Dr. Kapler, he's no schmuck. He's no YouTube or Google scholar. He is a very well-respected academic. So now in this paper titled A Brief History of Slavery and the Origins of American Policing, let's scroll down a bit to the highlighted section that I have here. Now read along with me, all right? The legacy of slavery and racism did not end after the Civil War. In fact, it can be argued that extreme violence against people of color became even worse with the rise of vigilante groups who resisted Reconstruction. Because vigilantes, by definition, have no external restraints, lynch mobs had a justified reputation of hanging minorities first and asking questions later. Because of its tradition of slavery, which rested on the racist rationalizations that blacks were subhuman, America had a long, shameful history of mistreating people of color long after the end of slavery. So, as you can see from what I read to you, it is no longer a foregone conclusion that when you say slavery or Jim Crow, that it automatically means black people. It's not what that means automatically anymore. And you see how people continue to play on this. And I want to keep going with this brief review of what I covered last week. Let's go to Jamal Bowman's website, where he spoke on in detail, or laid out in detail, what's called the Reconstruction agenda, right? And this, of course, plays off of the third Reconstruction, which is the talking point that they have on the Justice Democrats website. Okay, so reconcile with our history. By establishing a National Truth and Reconciliation Commission to investigate, document, and assess the federal government's role in America's history of racism. A federal investigation and commission modeled on the traditional justice approach in Germany, South Africa, and Rwanda. The purpose of the commission is to, number one, foster a national conversation on our government's history of racial discrimination and oppression. Number two, establish national memorials and curriculum standards to ensure and pass on the truths of our history. Number three, create an accounting of harm caused by our government's policies. And number four, create a proposal for reparations that would rectify the harms that were caused by our government. Like I stated last week, where in here are they saying anything about Black Americans or African Americans, let alone the technical terms that we like to use? Nowhere. So understand, when you don't make it when you don't make it a point to define who you're talking to, slavery and Jim Crow can literally apply to anybody. You see, they're not hiding any of this stuff anymore, ladies and gentlemen. It is all right there, front and center for everyone to see. So with that being said, the only question remaining is, what are we going to do about it? We'll save that answer for another video. And with all that being said, that does it for today's video. So please make sure you hit the subscribe button as well as the bell notification next to the subscribe button so you can be notified whenever I release a new video. All social media links will be pinned in the comment section below. Please make sure you text tdhiphop to number 33222. That's tdhiphop to number 33222. That way you'll get a direct text notification whenever I release a new video. But it also serves as a protection plan for myself in case YouTube ever gives this channel the axe. I'll be able to send you a direct link to where you can find me next. And lastly, but certainly not least, for those of you who have a love and appreciation for the work that I put in on this channel and would like to show your support towards the channel, the number one way you can show your support to me is through Patreon. For only $3 a month, that will help put TD Hip Hop Media in position to become independent of YouTube. Remember, the goal is not to grow big on YouTube, but to grow independent of YouTube. And until the next video, peace.